She did not scream at first. The silk caught flame in silence, as if even fire hesitated before defiling the sacred fabric that once swore her to a man, a throne, and a kingdom that would devour her. The dress, an ivory shroud sewn with threads of silver and prayer, turned to ash in layers, burning not outward, but inward, as though it sought to cauterize the soul before the skin. Her veil became a funeral smoke, her tiara a crown of glowing iron. The crowd stood unmoving, transfixed by the spectacle of royal immolation, not unlike children before a holy bonfire, mesmerized, obedient, curious. The scent was unbearable. Hair, lace, and flesh folded into one reek of melted sanctity. Her corset constricted not from bone or braid, but from flame, shrinking the skin in upon itself, tightening until her ribs no longer moved. Some whispered prayers, others choked on their own breath, but none turned away. This was not execution. This was ritual. She did not weep, not aloud. The only moisture came from her blistering eyes, boiled and blind, staring upward as if the heavens might remember her name. But even the sky remained closed. She had been chosen for this, not by God, but by lineage, mistake, and vengeance. They called it justice. But justice does not laugh as it burns its brides. This was not mercy. This was theater, and we tell this story because we care. Not for the royalty, but for you. For those who find themselves haunted by stories buried beneath palaces and prayers. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. She was born in a house that worshipped ceremony more than love. A palace, yes, but not a home. Marble walls bore the scent of damp tapestries and cold perfume, and her cradle was less a crib than a golden cage. Her mother died in childbirth, they said. Others whispered that she was poisoned before she could name her daughter, because naming is power, and power in royal courts is always lethal. The infant was baptized under the eye of 3 cardinals and 1 bishop, though none held her. Even then, her skin seemed too pale, her breath too quiet, her fate too loud. She was called Alenora, Latin-rooted, iron-laced, echoing the names of saints who were martyred by fire or blade. Her father, King Theobald II of Viramont, ruled a minor but bloody kingdom nestled in the folds of Central Europe, where borders bled more often than they held. The court called him pious, but it was a piety steeped in cruelty. His faith was not in God, but in obedience. His council included more torturers than theologians. To him, Alenora was not a child, but an alliance, barely weaned before her hand was promised to a rival prince who had once laid siege to their eastern frontier. By the age of 10, she could recite the holy book, perform her curtsies without sound, and smile for portraits that demanded nothing but stillness. She was raised, not by her father, but by governesses who smelled of lavender and rot, who pinched her shoulders into posture and told her that silence was a virtue for queens. There were no toys. There were relics, gilded bones of saints, cursed jewelry from dead noblewomen, books on poisons disguised as psalms. Her tutors called it education. Her nurses called it grooming. It was during a plague season that her destiny was sealed. A letter arrived with a wax seal cracked by age and fear. Prince Ardric of Grevenhold, the bastard son of a widowed monarch, had survived a war, 2 coups, and a fever that took half his kin. He wanted a bride to sanctify his throne, and her father's debts were too many to count. Thus, the girl was affianced to a man twice her age, a man who drank ink instead of wine and wrote sermons on skin. The marriage would unite their kingdoms, they said. It would cleanse their bloodlines, they lied. Preparations began at once. Her body was examined by physicians who checked her teeth, hips, and virginity as if she were livestock. Her wedding gown was designed not by tailors, but by monks who embroidered each seam with verses from Lamentations. It was heavy, unbearably so, as if meant to weigh her down into the earth even as she walked. The crown she would wear had belonged to a mad queen who drowned herself in holy oil, and yet the crown remained, untarnished, unburned, sacred in its madness. Whispers trailed her footsteps. Servants swore they saw her speak to shadows. A maid once found her staring at a painting of a beheaded saint for hours. A priest claimed he heard her humming a lullaby in reverse, but none dared question her readiness. She had learned to bow, to bleed silently during her monthly curse, to eat with restraint, to write letters that betrayed nothing of herself. In every mirror she did not see a girl. She saw an offering, and so, when the wedding day arrived, the bells did not ring, they tolled. The chapel was draped not in joy, but in crimson silk, the color of sacrifice, not celebration. Snow fell that morning, though it was spring, and some claimed it was ash. Her procession moved like a funeral march. The nobles smiled with teeth too sharp. The bishop's blessing trembled. Prince Odric stood waiting at the altar, robed in raven black, with eyes like extinguished candles. None knew what was written on the parchment in his sleeve. None saw the vial of oil hidden beneath the altar cloth. None suspected the dress itself had been altered, laced with a filament designed not to shimmer, but to spark. And in the galleries above, veiled women wept, not from sorrow, but from memory. They had worn similar gowns, walked similar aisles. Their tears were not warnings, they were rituals. History does not remember queens like Alienor for their words. It remembers them for their silence, and for how that silence ended. They said she was blessed, anointed, destined to be queen. But Alienor knew from the way her chest ached at night. That destiny was of violence, dressed in silk. Even before the vows were spoken, her soul began to shed itself in pieces. Small at first, like thread unraveling from a sleeve. The sickness did not arrive with cries or visions. It crept in quietly, the way rot enters wood, unseen until the structure splinters beneath its own weight. Her wedding night was not a ceremony of union, but a coronation of control. In the royal bedchamber, draped in velvet so dark it seemed to swallow light, Prince Odric laid beside her like a statue carved for punishment, not love. He did not strike her, not once, but his gaze dissected. He studied her fear the way a surgeon studies a wound, clinically, almost with reverence. She learned to lie still, to breathe without sound, to flinch before touch came. And so her mind became a fortress where the ghosts of herself were locked in rooms without light. Odric did not ask for her opinion, but he demanded her loyalty. Each morning, he handed her scriptures not for prayer, but for performance. She was ordered to recite, to memorize, to wear verses like shackles around her tongue. Her hair was cut short in penance for a sin unnamed. Her meals were rationed, not for famine, but for discipline. She was told it would cleanse the body. It only starved the will. She began to see things, or perhaps the things began to reveal themselves. In mirrors, her reflection came seconds too late. In candle flames, faces flickered, eyeless, open-mouthed, as if drowning in smoke. When alone, she whispered into corners, not from madness, but because the silence had become unbearable. There were nights when she scratched her own arms, not to bleed, but to remember where her body began and ended. Servants noticed. A maid once found her staring into the hearth for so long her hem began to smolder. Another claimed to hear her humming lullabies in a dead tongue. The confessor said she was being tested. The ladies in waiting said she was being punished. No one said she was breaking. And when the court demanded an heir, the weight shifted from suffocating to surgical. Odric began marking her cycles in a book lined with gold. The physician inspected her like livestock. Again, potions were brewed. Amulets were hung. When her womb remained empty, she was forbidden meat, then milk, then sunlight. Her walks were reduced to 10 paces in a straight line. No curves, no wandering, no pauses. Her letters were censored, her books burned. The tapestries in her room were replaced with crucifixion scenes. Her bathwater was laced with crushed lilies and chalk to drain the blackness from her mind. She stopped speaking, not out of defiance, but because her voice no longer recognized itself. The unraveling became visible only in fragments. A cracked teacup hidden behind a tapestry. A page from her prayer book, torn precisely down the line of a saint's face. A lock of her own hair found beneath the altar, braided into the shape of a noose. They said she was touched, cursed, possessed, but no demon had entered her. She had simply lost the war between submission and self. In the cold hours before dawn, she would crawl to the chapel barefoot, her gown trailing behind like a ghost seeking its grave. She knelt before statues with no eyes, whispering psalms backward, as if begging for time to unravel with her. She licked candle wax from her fingers, let thorns pierce her palms, and once, only once, tried to carve a name into the floorboards. Not her name. A different one. One she could never speak aloud. The walls, once lined with sacred scripture, now pressed inward like accusations. Her rooms smelled of wilted lavender and rust. Her wedding gown remained sealed in a glass armoire in the corner, untouched yet never dusted. It loomed like a coffin waiting for flesh. She began writing messages in lemon juice, invisible to the naked eye. They were never found, or perhaps never read. She buried small bones in the garden, birds, mice, a squirrel once strangled in ribbon. Each burial was a ceremony, a secret elegy, a mimicry of the funeral she knew would never be given to her, and the people, outside the castle gates, began to whisper that the queen never smiled, that she walked with her eyes closed, that she wore mourning colors beneath her gowns, that she had stitched a funeral shroud for a child that never existed. The priests intervened, of course. They demanded confession. She gave none. They suggested exorcism. Audric declined. Instead, she was sent to the tower of St. Mercilla, less a prison than a monastery carved into a cliffside. There, surrounded by relics of martyrs and the sound of seabirds screaming against wind, she was made to fast, to pray, to weep. But she did none of those things. She painted, with blood, with soil, with crushed berries stolen from the chapel altar. She painted scenes of women burning, crowned in ash, smiling as their skin blistered. A nun found one such image beneath her bed and destroyed it. The queen did not protest. She merely began painting on the walls. Her final return to court was not announced. She was brought back quietly, as if smuggling sorrow into a palace already too full of it. When she stepped back into the throne room, the courtiers gasped. Not from scandal, but from recognition. She had become the ghost they feared. Thin, pallid, expressionless. Her eyes were mirrors, her wrists ringed with faded bruises that looked like bracelets, her posture perfect but too still, like a statue afraid to crack. And then came the day the king made his decree. There would be a public ceremony, he said. A renewal of vows, a performance of devotion before God and nation. A second wedding to prove the queen's loyalty, her sanity, her grace. But she knew what it was. It was not a wedding, it was a sentence. She did not cry. She merely nodded and asked that her old wedding gown be brought down from the glass case, cleaned and worn again. The dress that had waited, the silk that had watched. And no one, not the seamstresses, not the ladies, not the priest, noticed that the threads had changed, that the lace now smelled faintly of oil, that the fabric shimmered too easily in candlelight. Her unraveling was no longer internal. It was a design, a preparation, a ritual waiting to be completed. The morning arrived cloaked in ash. The sky, once pale with spring's promise, hung low and swollen, its color neither gray nor white, but a sickly, undecided hue, like the bruised skin of a dying fruit. No birds sang, no bells rang. Only the wind, dragging through the palace corridors like breath through a throat filled with dust. Eleonora was dressed in silence. 6 maids attended her. None spoke. Their hands moved with ritualistic precision, fastening the bodice, straightening the veil, tightening the corset until breath became memory. The gown was heavier now, not just with age or fabric, but with something unseen. It did not rustle, it did not sway, it clung. It gripped her limbs like roots pulling downward. The embroidery, once glistening with silver thread, had been replaced. The new stitching shimmered not with light, but with intent. The hem smelled faintly of iron and something more elusive, the scent of lamp oil hidden beneath perfume. They crowned her again with the tiara of the Mad Queen. It fit more snugly this time, as if the metal had been waiting to complete its circle. As the final pin was placed, one of the maids dropped her comb. It shattered. No one moved to retrieve it. She was led to the chapel on foot, not in a carriage, not on a litter, but by walking, step by step, through the corridors of the palace that had starved her. Behind closed windows, courtiers watched, faces half-shadowed, their expressions torn between awe and dread. A few crossed themselves. Others turned away. A procession formed behind her, not of musicians, nor clergy, nor doves, but guards and torchbearers. The chapel stood open like a wound carved into stone. Red banners hung limp in the still air. A shallow platform had been erected before the altar, just high enough for all to see, yet low enough for the scent to reach. Prince Audric waited at its center, robed in a crimson so dark it bordered on black. His face bore no expression. His hands, gloved, were folded before him like those of a statue, elegant, inhuman, absolute. The crowd gathered in layers, nobles with lace collars and powdered hair, clergymen clutching relics and eyes too wide, servants in soot-stained aprons, their mouths half open, children hoisted onto shoulders, not understanding, only sensing that something sacred or wicked, or both, was about to be born. She stepped onto the platform, and the ceremony began. It was brief, more performance than prayer. The bishop recited verses of obedience and unity, his voice echoing off stone walls that had seen too many confessions, too few absolutions. Eleonora stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the stained glass above, the crucifixion scene cast in fractured reds and sickly golds, as though Christ himself were bleeding molten light. Then came the kiss. Audric leaned forward. Their lips did not touch. Instead, he whispered into her ear, a single word. She did not flinch. She merely closed her eyes. And then one of the torch-bearers moved forward. A candle, just a candle, tilted gently against the edge of her train. It happened slowly, as if the flame did not believe its purpose at first. A flicker, a tremble, then a hiss, soft, almost apologetic, as the fire kissed the silk and found it receptive. The dress ignited not in chaos, but in ceremony. Flame rippled across the hem like wine spilling across white cloth. A single breath, and the lower half of her gown bloomed into orange and gold. The heat rose in waves, warping the air. The embroidery curled inward, melting scripture into slag. For one heartbeat, the crowd remained silent, uncertain. Then she screamed, not loudly, not wildly, but like someone remembering how to speak. It was a sound pulled from the oldest part of the body, the part that knows death not as theory, but as ancestor. Her arms flailed, but the gown held fast. The veil caught next, bursting into flame with a hiss that made children sob and women faint. Her hair followed, igniting like dry brush. The tiara turned black. The scent was unbearable. burning silk, scorching skin, fat liquefying beneath flesh. A priest vomited behind the altar. A noblewoman shrieked and was dragged from the room. And yet no one stopped it, because it had not been declared an execution. It had been declared a vow. Ordric did not move. He watched her burn as one might watch a heretic prove the scriptures true. His eyes did not water. His jaw did not tighten. He stood still, untouched by the sparks that danced across the altar, unmoved by the sound of flesh rupturing. Her body convulsed. She collapsed to her knees, her arms outstretched, not in plea but in posture. For one brief, ghastly moment, she resembled the figure in the stained glass window behind her, a woman crucified not by nails, but by silence. She fell forward. Her hands struck the platform and left smears of red and wax. The fire did not dim. It fed. Then came the final act. The guards, on cue, stepped forward, not to save her, but to complete the rite. Buckets of water were thrown not to preserve her life, but to preserve the stage. The hiss that followed was deafening, an unholy marriage between extinguishment and agony. The fire died. What remained was not a queen. It was an object, a husk, curled inward like a child, fused to the platform by what had once been love, once been gown, once been flesh. Smoke filled the chapel. The scent would not leave for days. It would cling to the stone, the tapestries, the breath of every witness. No incense would mask it. No prayer could displace it. Ordric stepped down from the platform. He did not look back. The bishop declared the ceremony complete. The crowd dispersed. No one wept openly. No one screamed again. But that night across the kingdom, fires were banned. Candles were extinguished. Hearths were left cold. The people did not say her name. They merely dreamt of burning women and awoke with their hands shaking. In the days that followed, the platform was dismantled, the stone beneath it scrubbed, but the scorch marks never faded. And the stain, where her body had curled and blackened, remained. It remains still. If you walk into the chapel of Saint Viremont on the first day of spring, at the hour the bells should toll for weddings, you may hear a crackle in the silence. You may see in the corner of your eye a flicker of silk aflame. And if you kneel at the altar, you will smell her. Not perfume, not sanctity, but memory, burning and unburied. This was not justice, this was inheritance, and it had been passed down in fire. The morning arrived cloaked in ash. The sky, once pale with spring's promise, hung low and swollen, its color neither gray nor white, but a sickly, undecided hue, like the bruised skin of a dying fruit. No bird sang, no bells rang, only the wind dragging through the palaced corridors like breath through a throat filled with dust. Alinora was dressed in silence. 6 maids attended her. None spoke. Their hands moved with ritualistic precision, fastening the bodice, straightening the veil, tightening the corset until breath became memory. The gown was heavier now, not just with age or fabric, but with something unseen. It did not rustle, it did not sway, it clung, it gripped her limbs like roots pulling downward. The embroidery, once glistening with silver thread, had been replaced. The new stitching shimmered, not with light, but with intent. The hem smelled faintly of iron and something more elusive, the scent of lamp oil hidden beneath perfume. They crowned her again with the tiara of the Mad Queen. It fit more snugly this time, as if the metal had been waiting to complete its circle. As the final pin was placed, one of the maids dropped her comb. It shattered. No one moved to retrieve it. She was led to the chapel on foot, not in a carriage, not on a litter, but by walking, step by step, through the corridors of the palace that had starved her. Behind closed windows, courtiers watched, faces half-shadowed, their expressions torn between awe and dread. A few crossed themselves, others turned away. A procession formed behind her, not of musicians, nor clergy, nor doves, but guards and torchbearers. The chapel stood open like a wound carved into stone. Red banners hung limp in the still air. A shallow platform had been erected before the altar, just high enough for all to see, yet low enough for the scent to reach. Prince Audric waited at its center, robed in a crimson so dark it bordered on black. His face bore no expression. His hands, gloved, were folded before him like those of a statue, elegant, inhuman, absolute. The crowd gathered in layers, nobles with lace collars and powdered hair, clergymen clutching relics and eyes too wide, servants in soot-stained aprons, their mouths half open, children hoisted onto shoulders, not understanding, only sensing that something sacred or wicked or both was about to be born. She stepped onto the platform, and the ceremony began. It was brief, more performance than prayer. The bishop recited verses of obedience and unity, his voice echoing off stone walls that had seen too many confessions, too few absolutions. Eleonora stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the stained glass above, the crucifixion scene cast in fractured reds and sickly golds, as though Christ himself were bleeding molten light. Then came the kiss. Audric leaned forward. Their lips did not touch. Instead, he whispered into her ear a single word. She did not flinch. She merely closed her eyes. And then one of the torch-bearers moved forward. A candle, just a candle, tilted gently against the edge of her train. It happened slowly, as if the flame did not believe its purpose at first. A flicker, a tremble, then a hiss, soft, almost apologetic. As the fire kissed the silk and found it receptive, the dress ignited not in chaos, but in ceremony. Flame rippled across the hem like wine spilling across white cloth. A single breath, and the lower half of her gown bloomed into orange and gold. The heat rose in waves, warping the air. The embroidery curled inward, melting scripture into slag. For one heartbeat, the crowd remained silent, uncertain. Then she screamed, not loudly, not wildly, but like someone remembering how to speak. It was a sound pulled from the oldest part of the body, the part that knows death not as theory but as ancestor. Her arms flailed, but the gown held fast. The veil caught next, bursting into flame with a hiss that made children sob and women faint. Her hair followed, igniting like dry brush. The tiara turned black. The scent was unbearable. Burning silk, scorching skin, fat liquefying beneath flesh. A priest vomited behind the altar. A noblewoman shrieked and was dragged from the room. And yet no one stopped it, because it had not been declared an execution. It had been declared a vow. Audric did not move. He watched her burn as one might watch a heretic prove the scriptures true. His eyes did not water. His jaw did not tighten. He stood still, untouched by the sparks that danced across the altar, unmoved by the sound of flesh rupturing. Her body convulsed. She collapsed to her knees, her arms outstretched, not in plea but in posture. For one brief, ghastly moment, she resembled the figure in the stained glass window behind her. A woman crucified not by nails, but by silence. She fell forward. Her hands struck the platform and left smears of red and wax. The fire did not dim. It fed. Then came the final act. The guards, on cue, stepped forward. Not to save her, but to complete the rite. Buckets of water were thrown not to preserve her life, but to preserve the stage. The hiss that followed was deafening, an unholy marriage between extinguishment and agony. The fire died. What remained was not a queen. It was an object, a husk, curled inward like a child, fused to the platform by what had once been love, once been gown, once been flesh. Smoke filled the chapel. The scent would not leave for days. It would cling to the stone, the tapestries, the breath of every witness. No incense would mask it. No prayer could displace it. Ordric stepped down from the platform. He did not look back. The bishop declared the ceremony complete. The crowd dispersed. No one wept openly. No one screamed again. But that night, across the kingdom, fires were banned. Candles were extinguished. Hearths were left cold. The people did not say her name. They merely dreamt of burning women and awoke with their hands shaking. In the days that followed, the platform was dismantled. The stone beneath it scrubbed. But the scorch marks never faded. And the stain, where her body had curled and blackened, remained. It remains still. If you walk into the chapel of St. Viramont on the first day of spring, at the hour the bells should toll for weddings, you may hear a crackle in the silence. You may see in the corner of your eye a flicker of silk aflame. And if you kneel at the altar, you will smell her. Not perfume, not sanctity, but memory, burning and unburied. This was not justice. This was inheritance, and it had been passed down in fire. The kingdom awoke the morning after the flame had claimed its queen as though from a nightmare too vivid to forget, yet too brutal to name aloud. Smoke still curled from the chapel's shattered windows, drifting over the cobbled streets like a mournful spirit reluctant to depart. The scent of burnt silk and scorched flesh seeped into every corner, into the market stalls where children once played, into the wine cellars where laughter once lingered, into the very air that seemed now thickened with sorrow and dread. Yet the court moved with an eerie precision, as if rehearsing a play whose ending none wished to admit was real. Prince Audric resumed his seat behind the throne, his face a mask carved from stone. The nobles bowed and whispered, their words measured and hollow, like echoes in an empty cathedral. No song was sung, no feast prepared, only the distant tolling of bells that marked neither mourning nor celebration, but a silence heavier than either. Outside the palace gates, the common folk gathered, curious and fearful, their faces lined with grief and confusion. Some carried tokens of the queen, scraps of lace salvaged from her shattered gown, wilted flowers from the chapel steps, even small candles lit in trembling hands. They dared not speak her name, for it was said aloud only in the shadows, where whispers multiplied like ghosts. The city's priests preached sermons cloaked in ambiguous sorrow, speaking of divine will and trials, faith. Their voices trembled beneath the vaulted ceilings, echoing off stone walls that had witnessed countless rites of passage, but none so cruelly profound. Some among the clergy called for penance, others urged silence. No one dared question the king's judgment, yet the weight of doubt hung thick as incense, choking the breath from those who sought comfort. Whispers grew into rumors. The queen had been marked by sin, some said, a witch's curse, a madness that twisted her mind and body alike. Others claimed the prince's hand had been guided by God himself, delivering justice not through sword or poison, but through the purifying flame. A few spoke in hushed tones of darker designs. Betrayal within the palace walls, a conspiracy sealed by blood and fire. The truth dissolved beneath the tide of speculation, leaving only a hollow ache where certainty once lived. The nobles, for their part, divided like fractured glass. Some withdrew into gilded chambers, avoiding public eyes as if their own reflections might shatter beneath scrutiny. Others flaunted loyalty with forced smiles and public displays of fealty, attending mass and court gatherings with calculated grace. The palace became a theater of veiled threats and silent alliances, each gesture a dagger cloaked in velvet. No one spoke openly of the queen's death, but all felt its shadow looming, an unspoken reminder of power's fragility and the cost of dissent. In the days that followed, the palace chaplain ordered the chapel to be cleansed. Holy water splashed upon stone, prayers murmured like spells to chase away lingering evil. Yet no ritual could erase the scorch marks etched deep into the altar's foundation, nor the faint outline of a woman's silhouette burned into the wooden floor. Servants whispered that on certain nights, when the moon hung low and the wind stilled, a flicker of flame danced where no candle burned, and a faint sob echoed beneath the chapel's vaulted ceiling. The queen's belongings were gathered swiftly and silently. Her wedding dress, once the vessel of her doom, was sealed within a leaden chest and locked away in the deepest vaults beneath the castle. It was said that the fabric, though blackened and brittle, still carried a faint warmth, as if the fire had not fully relinquished its claim. Few dared to touch the chest, and fewer still dared to open it. To do so was to invite the past back into the present, to stir embers better left cold. Meanwhile, the populace found their rituals disrupted. Weddings were postponed, festivals cancelled, and even the simple act of lighting a fire at dusk became an act fraught with superstition. Mothers hushed their children's laughter, wary of drawing attention from unseen eyes. The streets emptied earlier, and shadows seemed to grow longer and thicker. Fear, once a distant whisper, became a tangible presence, an invisible shroud wrapping the city in quiet despair. And yet, amidst the silence, small acts of rebellion flickered like the dying embers of a fire refused to be snuffed out. Secret gatherings took place in hidden corners, whispered prayers for the queen's soul, offerings left at crossroads, and songs sung in voices too soft for the palace walls to hear. These acts, fragile and fleeting, were the kingdom's heartbeat, an aching reminder that even in death, the queen's story refused to be forgotten. Prince Audric's reign continued, but the crown he wore seemed heavier with each passing day. His eyes, once cold and impenetrable, began to betray a weariness born not of age but of guilt and unspoken torment. Behind closed doors, he paced in restless shadows, haunted by the flames that consumed the woman who had once been promised to him, and perhaps by the fire he himself had kindled. In the court, rumors whispered of secret executions, sudden illnesses, and disappearances. Those who had spoken too freely or shown too much sympathy to the fallen queen. The palace walls, once thick and impenetrable, now seemed porous, leaking fear like blood from a wound. Loyalty became currency, and betrayal a silent epidemic. The people spoke in riddles and half-truths, their grief layered with anger and confusion. They mourned not only a queen, but a promise shattered, a kingdom that had chosen cruelty over compassion, ritual over mercy, spectacle over humanity. The flames that had taken Eleanora alive became a symbol, not of justice, but of a legacy scorched and twisted by power. This was not the end of a story, it was the beginning of a reckoning. They did not build her a tomb. There was no marble effigy, no plaque etched with date and virtue, no crypt in which mourners could leave lilies or prayers. Queens before her had been entombed beneath gilded domes, surrounded by relics and holy verses, remembered for their wombs and their silences. Eleanora was not given that. She was not buried. She was extinguished, and like smoke, her memory was treated as vapor, dispersed before it could take shape. But fire leaves residue. Ash clings to stone long after flame departs, and memory, like soot, settles into cracks that time cannot seal. In the years that followed her death, the kingdom of Viramont spoke her name only in riddles, if at all. Children whispered of a flaming bride who wandered forests at dusk, her veil trailing sparks behind her. Seamstresses refused to work with ivory silk, claiming the fabric burned too quickly in candlelight. Chapels altered their rites, brides no longer walked with torches, and veils were blessed twice to ensure protection. These were not edicts, they were reflexes, born of fear, of guilt, of unresolved mourning. Yet beneath these surface superstitions, a deeper wound festered. The court attempted to repaint her legacy, commissioning portraits that bore little resemblance to the woman who burned. In these images, Eleanora was always serene, bathed in heavenly light, a saint martyred by madness, not malice. The fire was often omitted. When it appeared, it was rendered symbolically, transformed into golden halos, gentle glows, divine radiance. A lie lacquered with paint and sanctimony. The clergy canonized her suffering in whispers, careful not to indict the crown. Some called her Saint Eleanor of the purifying flame. Not officially, never in public, but in prayers spoken under breath, beside bedsides, in convents filled with women who recognized something in her silence. She became a symbol, not of sin, but of sacrifice, not of obedience, but of endurance. Yet symbols are not truth, and truth, when silenced, finds other tongues. A century after her death, an apocryphal text surfaced, an anonymous manuscript titled The Bride of Ashes. Its pages were crude, ink-faded, words uneven. But its verses sang of a queen whose womb was a battleground, whose body was a scroll written in burns. The author, unnamed, wrote not as historian, but as mourner. She was described not as mad, but as made mad, not as heretic, but as herald of a kingdom that devoured its daughters in the name of decorum. The church condemned the text. It was banned, burned, erased, but it was copied, by hand, in secret, preserved in the lining of cloaks, tucked inside psalters, whispered between cloistered women who understood what it meant to be chosen for silence. Her wedding dress, what remained of it, was never displayed. It stayed hidden in the vaults beneath Viramont's palace, sealed in lead and forgotten by name but not by dread. Generations of guards refused to touch the chest. Some claimed it emitted heat even in winter. Others swore they heard the rustle of silk when passing by. One guard, in a letter smuggled out to a monastery, described a dream in which the dress moved on its own, floating, faceless, crowned, burning from within. He was dismissed the next morning. His letter was never found again. And so, Eleanora became myth. Not the soft myth of lullabies or moral fables, but the hard myth of bloodline and flame. She existed between memory and metaphor, half woman, half warning. A reminder that queens were not born. They were built, used, and, if necessary, burned. The women of the kingdom began weaving her likeness into tapestries hidden beneath layers of more acceptable saints. Her profile, wreathed in smoke, stitched into the background behind altars and shrines. They named no daughter Eleanora, not out of disdain, but out of reverence too deep to desecrate with imitation. She became the name that mothers held in their mouths, but never spoke, the name they looked at when teaching their daughters to walk carefully, to bow deeper, to silence their own fire before it drew attention. Yet despite every attempt to bury her beneath myth or ritual, Eleanora remained. She remained in the burn marks on the chapel floor, in the smell of charred fabric that returned each spring, in the nervous glances brides cast at their own gowns. She was the unanswered prayer, the crack in the stained glass, the scream that never faded from the stone. They tried to erase her. They failed, because fire, once lit, may die, but it never forgets. The morning she was to die, the sky wore a crown of grey. Not rain, not sun, just a pale, flat silence, as if even nature held its breath. She was brought out at dawn. Her wrists were bound in soft silks, red, ceremonial, chosen not for comfort, but irony. The same crimson shade her wedding garlands had once held. Her dress, white as ash, had been soaked in oils under the guise of purification. The scent of rosewater tried to hide the truth. But death has a smell, and she had learned to recognize it. The courtyard had been swept, cleansed, and lined with herbs to mask the stench of burning. Nobles watched from balconies. Clergymen stood with scrolls of prayer. Peasants were allowed to attend, but only from behind the gate. Even in death, she had to be a queen. Even in flames, she must remain a performance. She did not speak when they read her crimes. She simply looked forward. There was no lover beside her, no brother, no child, only silence. The same court that once adored her now turned its gaze downward, as if afraid she might make eye contact and remind them of their cowardice. The king, her husband, stood behind a veil, not because he wished to mourn in private, but because he could not risk the people seeing the smirk he could not suppress. The executioner approached, but this was no axe, no rope. It was a pyre, carefully built, lovingly arranged, oak wood beneath, branches of laurel and myrrh, symbolic, sacred, and slow to burn. They lifted her onto it gently, as if she were still bride and not condemned. She did not resist. They tied her ankles, her waist, her arms. She whispered a name, too faint to be heard. And then they lit the fire. First came the smoke, thick, white, clinging to the air like lace. It coiled around her legs, kissed her feet. Then the heat, rising like breath from the earth. Her eyes widened, not in fear, but in final comprehension. The fire touched the hem of her dress, and the queen began to disappear. At first, there was no sound, only the crackling of betrayal. The silk melted faster than flesh. It curled like parchment, folding inward, consuming itself. Her hands, bound across her stomach, vanished under flame. Skin blistered, then split. Her hair ignited like dry reeds, a brief golden halo before it blackened and fell away. Then came the scream. It was not one of agony alone. It was the sound of legacy unraveling, of centuries of silence erupting through a single throat. The kind of sound that leaves echoes in architecture. Some spectators turned away, others wept, but the king watched until the very end, unmoving. He believed this would erase her from memory, that the fire would turn her name to ash like her body. But fire does not only destroy, it reveals, it purifies, and it remembers. The dress, once a symbol of purity, had become her shroud, but in burning it became something more. It became a prophecy. For on that same balcony where the king stood smirking, a single blackbird landed, silent, still, and remained there as the queen's body crumbled into embers. It watched, unblinking. It did not fly away when the fire died, nor when the guards swept her remains into an urn. It perched until nightfall, and the next morning the king was found dead in his bed, face frozen in a rictus of terror. No wounds, no poison, just wide, scorched eyes and the faint scent of smoke in the sheets. The queen's name was never spoken in court again, but in kitchens, in markets, in the whispered prayers of women and the cautionary tales of daughters, she lived on, not as victim, not as martyr, but as warning. For every time a bride lifts her veil, there are embers beneath, and every palace has a room that smells faintly of burning silk. Evening had fallen like a velvet curtain upon the kingdom, and with it the last remnants of mercy. Candles flickered along the marbled halls of the royal estate, each flame swaying in rhythm to an unseen, ominous score. The walls, draped in crimson banners and veils of mourning silk, seemed to lean inward, as if the castle itself were mourning what was to come. In the great hall, an orchestra played, not for joy, not for celebration, but for ceremony. A masquerade had been declared, though no guest was permitted to decline. The queen, once called Isolde the Pale, now renamed by whispers as the widow in waiting, was to attend her final supper. She was dressed not by handmaids, but by law. Her wedding dress, retrieved from a vault and untouched since her cursed marriage day, was laid before her like a relic of torment. The gown had yellowed from time, yet it held its cruel elegance. The silk still shimmered like moonlight on snow, the embroidery twisted like veins of silver around her torso. Pearls were sewn into the sleeves, each one said to contain a single tear shed by her mother on the day she was born. A dress meant to usher her into womanhood now prepared her for the grave. She stood before the mirror, her reflection fractured by candlelight, and for a moment she did not recognize herself. The woman staring back had hollowed cheeks, eyes rimmed in red, and lips bitten raw, not from vanity, but from silence. The hair, once brushed into royal curls, now hung like wet rope. But it was her eyes, those twin relics of defiance that still burned. They had not dimmed, not yet. When the door creaked open, it was not a servant who entered, but Lord Remiel, the steward of execution, dressed in black robes lined with gold thread. He did not bow. His voice was low and without cruelty. "It is time, Majesty." She turned to him not as a queen, but as a woman undone. "Is it to be public?" "By decree." "And the dress?" "By design." He offered his arm, and she took it, not out of trust, but as the final gesture of dignity she could perform. In the courtyard, a dais had been built, stone beneath, wood above. At its center stood a throne of iron, soaked in oil and surrounded by garlands of dried roses. The crowd had gathered in a hushed reverence. Nobles in masks, priests with censers, even the children had been dressed in black for the occasion, their hands clutching prayer books they could not yet read. Trumpets did not sound. Instead, the bells of the cathedral began to toll, 7 slow chimes to mark the 7 sins of betrayal they claimed she had committed. Adultery, treason, witchcraft, heresy, murder of bloodline, seduction of the throne, and worst of all, silence. She ascended the stairs barefoot, the silk of her gown dragging behind like a bridal train of ghosts. Every step echoed, not just in the stone, but in the minds of all who watched her. She did not cry. She did not beg. She did not even blink when the priest anointed her with holy oil, meant not to bless, but to ensure the flames caught quickly. As she sat upon the throne, the silence deepened. Lord Remiel stepped forward, his voice like gravel dragged through ice. "By the power of the crown and the sanctity of the church, let the judgment of flame be rendered. May the fire find truth in your bones." With that, the torches were lowered. First, the hem. The lace caught quickly, curling into black. Then the pearls, each one bursting with a tiny pop as their inner moisture boiled to steam. Her veil flared upward, a banner of flame waving farewell. The silk twisted around her arms like snakes made of light, devouring inch by inch. And still, she did not scream. Only when the fire reached her waist did she finally speak. Her voice cracked but clear. "Tell them. I danced." A moment passed, and then, unbelievably, she began to move. Her hands, though bound, lifted ever so slightly. Her head tilted, her shoulders swayed. What appeared first as tremors revealed itself as rhythm. She was dancing. As the fire bloomed from her chest and burst like a crown across her hair, she gave the world her final performance. The last waltz of fire. Children wept, women clutched their husbands, men turned their eyes downward in shame. But the queen burned on, until her body became light and the throne ash. When the flames were extinguished and the remains swept away, the king ordered her name removed from every text, every painting, every chapel wall. But ink is not memory, and memory is not so easily erased. In the months that followed, strange things occurred. The roses in the royal garden bloomed only in winter and bled red from their stems. The mirror in the queen's chamber cracked without cause, and every masquerade thrown by the court ended in one guest catching fire. Spontaneous, unprovoked, they whispered of a curse, of a spirit in silk, but those who had truly watched her dance, who had felt the fire not on their skin but in their guilt, knew the truth. The queen had not died that night. She had been reborn, not in flesh, but in story. and no story once burned into a nation's soul can be unremembered. She never left the chapel, not in body nor in myth. Where her flesh once turned to soot, they laid no tomb, no plaque, no memorial, only silence. And yet that silence spoke louder than any bell that ever rang over her kingdom. In the generations that followed, every queen who entered that altar room, whether dressed in white or black, in lace or steel, felt the ghost of that scorched moment in the air. Some claimed to smell roses burned at the stem. Others claimed the glass panes wept condensation on sunny days. But the truth was simpler. The truth always is. She became a shadow, not just in the halls of the palace, but in the language of rule. Her name was struck from most documents, rewritten in margins, etched over by successors more palatable to the court. The scorched queen. Some dared whisper, but never aloud, never before the clergy or crown. There was power in names, and her name had become a curse, a prayer, and a warning all at once. Yet for all their efforts, they could not erase her fully. Because fire, once it touches something, never fully lets go. The queen's sister, who had once envied her smile and the gown she wore, never married. She wore mourning black until her own death, even in the summer heat. It was said she slept with a locket of charred silk beneath her pillow and spoke to it as one might to a cradle. She never entered the chapel again. The king, or the man who called himself that, ruled for 6 more years. But those years were not years of glory. They were rotted at the core. The crops failed, the rivers dried. 3 of his counselors hanged themselves, and in his sleep he was heard screaming, not roaring orders or insults as he did in life, but crying out like a boy lost in a forest. "Not her," he'd whisper. "Not the dress. Take me instead." But fire does not barter. It only consumes. When he finally died, struck down by a blade of his own blood, his corpse was found with fingernails clawed down to the bone, as if he had tried to tear out something from within himself, something that could not be removed. As for the people, they carried her memory in the only way people can, in story, in rhyme, in secret. Children sang songs about a lady in white whose feet never touched the floor. Old midwives swore that any bride who wore too much lace would be cursed by the Ash Maiden. And when thunder cracked over the hills during a wedding, villagers would murmur, "She remembers. She always remembers." In time, a new cathedral was built over the ruins of the old one, a modern monument of gilded marble and imported saints. But beneath the stone, the earth had not forgotten. The first wedding held there ended in an inexplicable fire. The candles refused to stay lit afterward. The second wedding ended in a miscarriage. The third was simply abandoned, bride fleeing before her vows could even be uttered. Only then did the clergy begin to suspect what the peasants had always known. She was still there. Not in rage, not in vengeance, but in something colder, sadder. She had become the question none of them could answer. What do we become when the world kills the version of us it dressed in white? She had been made a queen, but not crowned, married, but not loved, worshipped, but not saved. Her wedding gown, once stitched to please 1,000 noble eyes, had become the dress of her execution. No longer a garment, but a pyre wrapped in lace. In the end, no one could tell where the bride ended and the martyr began. And maybe that was the lesson, that sometimes history does not burn the wicked. It burns the beautiful, the obedient, the ones who smiled too long at men who carried matches behind their backs. In our time, she is forgotten by name, but she lives in every photograph of a bride looking into the mirror and asking herself, silently, am I walking into love or into fire? And no one can answer. But you, dear listener, you will remember, because you heard her story. And some stories, once burned, cannot be buried. They float above the altar like smoke, until someone breathes them in and tells them again.